What do you make of these comments of the interview? I mean, it was an unprecedented two-part interview here.
Oh, David does a great job. I mean, a lot to glean from that without question. There's a lot of hopium, as Dan will tell you. Self-driving is the way. I mean, their head of self-driving basically said, I think it was earlier this month, that Waymo is a couple years ahead of them. So there clearly is competition. But break down the stock from here. Made an all-time high close to $500 earlier this year for a lot of different reasons. Traded down to that sort of 220 level, which we collectively said was support before, should be support again. This bounce that you've seen, and you just mentioned it's a big one, is about a 50% retracement of that entire move. It makes sense that we're here. The question is, do you continue to own the stock on the optimism, or do you trade around the edges, which has been an opportunity for the last few years?
Yeah, so what's interesting, you asked, is it driving the stock? When you look at Waymo, they probably have 700 cars, out there in 4 different cities right now. They work pretty well. I've been in them. It's a pretty interesting experience. It takes up to 4 people in those cars. In the Google or Alphabet's other bets last year, they lost about $2 billion, right? So this takes me back to Tesla back in the day. The Model S and the Model X were meant to fund what's going on in the lower end, which is the Model 3 and the Model Y. Now, those cars have done really well. I think it's a really low percentage of the cars that they make right now or those higher end ones. So if you think about all the losses that Alphabet has just to put Waymo on the streets, until you get some level of scale, these things are not scaling. Even the Waymo is not scaling. So when you think about what's going on, they're going to launch 10, maybe 20 of these Robotaxis or cybercabs. They're 2-seat cars, which is kind of, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
They're 2-seat cars. And so at the end of the day, if Tesla's going to make these things, then that means that they have to own the fleet. And that's something that we learned this from Uber over the last 10 or years or so. Nobody wants to own the fleet. If you want to talk about losses until something scales, that's the thing. And one last point, when you look at earnings for Tesla, they're expected to do $4 in 2027. They did $4.07 back in 2022. So you got to figure out how to pay for this thing. So if the stock is up 40% right now, it's got over $1 trillion market cap. I just don't see how it grows into that because Optimus is years away.
Yeah, I don't really think there's much debate over whether or not, the stock is trading a bit dislocated from the actual automotive business. I mean, if you look at the last quarter's numbers, you had a 20% decline in revenue and 71% decline in net income. So clearly that coupled with the 40% rally, you see some dislocation there. That doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. With that said, and Dad makes a good point. If you talk about the fleet, you typically don't see these type of multiples on very highly capital-intensive businesses. It just kind of erodes gross margin. You have deferred maintenance. You have CapEx. You have all of these things that you have to, an inflated cost basis that makes it very tough to support that type of multiple. With that said, I clearly think, the bulls are all about humanoid robots, full self-driving, and you really have to get behind that story if you're going to own the stock, particularly at this level.
It has never traded with an auto multiple. It has never traded on sales. It has never traded on all these things that you guys are talking about. It's always traded on hope.
Yeah.
Adam Jonas of Morgan Stanley makes an interesting point. He says most of the valuation of Tesla is based on products that have no disclosure, little disclosure, or are far from commercialization. And it has always been the case for Tesla's valuation that has made up the bulk of the valuation. Julie Beal, I know you can't get on board with Tesla. But can you see why others might?
No, not at all. I think the real thing is that it's all kind of hopes and dreams. Remember, the very first time we talked about robotaxis was in 2019, and Elon was promising 1 million robotaxis by 2020. So I think the credibility gap with the proclamations that we're expecting has always been very wide. There's never really been an ability to deliver. And I think if you look at what the Cybertruck really means, it's an inability to recognize product market fit. And I think it's the same with having a 2-seater for your Robotaxi. You're really building off of what you think is kind of cool and great, but I really don't have conviction that it's what the market is looking for. And I think that's really what's going to hinder the stock and earnings, although it doesn't seem to really matter in terms of the stock multiple. But I do think at a fundamental level, there's really not enough here to justify anywhere near this level of valuation.